Hello, I'm Stephen Hunt, and welcome to Dodging Bullets, the Insolvency Practitioner's Guide to Surviving the Week. In this episode, my guest is one of Insolvency's great communicators, former president of R3, started at the official receiver, I think, in 1980. He's worked for firms large and small. One of the firms went bust on him, which might be something we cover. He's a regular speaker and trainer. He's also worked for a litigation funder, and he's now sort of retired, although I think there are speaking engagements in his diary already. Welcome, Nick O'Reilly.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for the invite to come on and chat.
So I've covered your CV, so we don't have to talk about that. But are there any aspects you wanted to raise at this stage? Really, I brought you on because, as I said, you're a great communicator. But also, I was fascinated to think about the status of retired IPs. If you're no longer regulated, you can say anything you like, but you always did. So the platform's sort of yours to chat about issues that you'd change, everything and anything. Over to you, Nick.
Well, I think the first thing I just wanted to raise was a sort of come back on the previous podcast that you did where you sort of round up your earlier podcasts. And I think it might have been Andy mentioned that Ian Beale in EastEnders had gone bankrupt and the trustee that was portrayed came across as a bit shifty. And I was just sort of reminded that in the early 80s, when I first started at the official receivers, London Weekend Television did a series called The Trustee, and it starred Paul Nicholas as the bankrupt. And the trustee was a lady, and the whole sort of ethos of the programme was whether Paul Nicholas could use his charm and good looks to persuade the trustee that he was okay hiding his assets. And she played it very cool and professional, but there was an underlying element of, will they, won't they get it together? But the technical advisor on that was Bernard Phillips, who was a sort of insolvency practitioner in the 60s and 70s. So if you want to look at, if anyone could ever find, whether or not in the archives, there is this 6-part series called The Trustee, but that was all about the interactions between the trustee and the bankrupt. So I just thought I'd raise that for people's interest.
I shall get my best investigator straight onto that. That's a great lead. I have a connection to one in the 90s. In the 1980s, Ray Winstone played a bankrupt tailor in a series of Get Back. And the interesting thing was that we were Ray's trustees in bankruptcy because he didn't pay the tax on his fee from the first series, I think. And so without going into too much detail, we spent a lot of time going through Ray's income from various sources as we could find it. But yes, he went bankrupt over non-payment of tax on a role where he played a bankrupt.
That's rather ironic, isn't it? The other thing I was just going to raise was you had a discussion about the administrators of Sheffield Wednesday. And I just wanted to put in another point on that, which is that, of course, the Football League have a ridiculous insolvency policy that says, in the first instance, the administrator must exit by way of a company voluntary arrangement. All football creditors must be paid, and all other creditors must receive 25 pence in the pound. And if you fail to do any of those, then you will suffer a 15-point deduction in the following season. And so, in a way, the administrators were sort of hamstrung by the fact that they had to ask for £40 million for a business which actually is probably worth an awful lot less, because they had to demonstrate to the Football League that they had attempted to meet their insolvency policy. And of course, they found a purchaser who said, we'll pay you 40 million. But I think the administrators were a bit wary that they would do that. So they said, okay, you can have a period as preferred bidder, but we need you to cover all the costs of the administration during that period whilst you're doing your due diligence. So in a way, they didn't make the position worse, but we've ended up in the position where we thought we'd always would end up, i.e. that the thing is worth an awful lot less and they're going to end up with a 15-point deduction. So it's unfortunate. I don't think the administrators really wanted the preferred bidder, but they had to go through this sort of rigmarole of showing the Football League that they were trying to meet their policy, which, frankly, they could never meet.
I was worried beforehand that I was going to have trouble controlling you, but that's already given me. So far too many... the cats are already out of the bag, and herding them back is going to be impossible if you've got so many things on issues on so many subjects. Well, the crazy world of football. You and I sort of. I was looking again. The insolvency of Portsmouth FC. you were making comments and I was making suggested amendments to the proposals, which was causing chaos in public. But yeah, the world of football insolvency defies most logic and most laws, including insolvency, I think. It's and I mean, in the 15-point deduction, teams like Watford, I'm not sure they've got 15 points to have deducted some seasons.
Exactly.
Moving on, a little bit of biography. Let's just talk about your days in the OR. So you were one of those rare cases now, pre-Insolvency Act 86, working in the OR. What was that like?
It was fantastic from a point of view of a first job, because you met people of a similar age and we all knew nothing about insolvency. And we used to go to parties and people would say, "What job do you do?" And I say, "I work in the official receiver." And they would say, well, what's that? And you'd say, "Well, it deals with people who go insolvent." And they'd say, "Well, is that glue sniffing?" Say, no, that's not insolvent. That's solvent abuse. But nobody had a clue what we did. And the sad thing was that was the external view. Internally, we knew nothing as well, because for most of us, having joined at 18 or 19, we were asking bankrupts in their 50s questions about mortgages, debentures, reversionary interests in any freeholds, which none of us had ever encountered in our very sort of sheltered upbringing. So it was a bit of a case of the blind leading the blind. There were an awful lot of questions in the questionnaire that we asked bankrupts, which were answered no, because the bankrupt didn't understand it, and neither did we. So therefore, the only answer that we could put down was no. So I look back with great fondness at my time in the official receivers. It was a very steep learning curve to go from no knowledge of insolvency to, by the end of 5 years, feeling that I at least understood the terminologies just before the Insolvency Act 1986 came out.
And you left in 85. I won't list your firms and bits and pieces, but as I said, you worked for small and large firms. So any particular differences in approach, would you say, over the years?
I think that I primarily always saw myself as a small firm practitioner in my early days of my career. So working at Booth White and at Brothman Pansol, we were a small firm. And I think in those days I was slightly, and it may be my own chip on my shoulder, but I always thought, crikey, these people who work at bigger firms, they're far more intelligent than I am. They're far better. They're far more complex situations they're dealing with. I'm dealing with a lot of liquidations, which are sort of straight in, straight out, and they're dealing with these massive jobs. So part of the attraction towards going to a national firm was to see whether I could cut the mustard. The reality was that actually at the bigger firms, there are an awful lot. There are some good people, and don't get me wrong, I met some really, really good people, but there are also some fairly average people who, and the reason they were able to work in those sort of size firms was they were able to hide. And you couldn't hide in a small firm because, the lines of command between the staff and the partner are very, very short. But in a large firm, you could sort of get hidden in the role of assistant manager or whatever and not actually manage anything, let alone your own caseload. So that was an eye-opener to me, because I thought I would struggle intellectually going to a bigger firm. Actually, I don't think I struggled intellectually, but what I did struggle with was the fact that the staff weren't as good as I thought they were going to be.
So did you prefer being the small fish or the big cog, whatever it is, whatever the analogy is?
I much preferred being able to make a difference. One of the things that you notice that the bigger the firm is, you could make suggestions, but they didn't get followed through. Whereas in sort of smaller firm, you could just make that change yourself by just changing some of the standards or changing some of the letters that were going out. You could do that. So I found working in a small firm much better, because you could, if you had good staff around you in a small firm, they really did get involved and take quite substantial parts of the case. Whereas in a larger firm, I ended up finding myself that if you were working with an average member of staff, you were doing more of it yourself, a bit like you would have done in a small firm, but you're doing it in a bigger firm.
I think that reflects similar to my experience. I mean, I worked for Barclays International back in the day, massive company, and working again for a very small Griffins with 6 people back in the early 90s. The talking to other IPs as well, the difference is you can get good and bad in both both sizes of firms. In the small firms, you tend to have dominant single characters. So if they're a force for good, they're very, very good. If they're not so good, there's no one to tell them they're wrong. And in a big firm, I agree. You can have some great people who on a big stage can really use it, or there's a lot of people who are just simply charging time and sort of just adding to the whip without any perceivable event for their entire careers. And also, I think in looking at some of the misconduct cases I've dealt with, you had the dishonesty in small firms occasionally with a principal. In a bigger firm, the character of dishonesty is quite different. They're having to get round systems, but they still did. So there was no difference, I would say, in honesty either. So intelligence, work rate, anything else, it made no difference. It's about your character and what you preferred.
But one of the things that I noticed when I started to get involved in disciplinary committees, when I was just started as an insolvency practitioner qualified, I joined the ICAW Joint IPA Committee for disciplinary matters. And that was the time when one of the big four basically closed cases in members' voluntary liquidations, and any undistributed balance they just put into a separate sort of suspense account. And then once a year they would sweep through this suspense account and just take all the money. And you're talking about hundreds of thousands of pounds they were just sweeping up as sort of balances of their loads and loads of cases. And I remember at the time that they defended it really, really highly, and they had lawyers and barristers representing their part, and they ended up being fined £30,000. And I thought to myself, if a small firm had taken excessive remuneration of maybe £5,000 or £10,000, would they have been treated as leniently as that big four member? But I remember going away from that meeting thinking, actually, there is a bit of one rule for one and one rule for another. The large firm pays an awful lot of members to be members of the organisation, and the small firm only pays one or two. So perhaps there is two-tier justice in that sense. But that did upset me because the firm involved would have made that fee back the next day on another of their jobs.
I mean, yeah, it's a topic I've looked at very carefully, and there is an impression from small firms that big firms get it easier. I'm not so sure. I mean, I have seen Neville Khan, the actual Neville Khan, whatever, on the big stage. Equally, I had a case with Institute where I investigated a loss of license, where the IP had taken 100 or 1,000, I think, in remuneration improperly, had come up in the QAD inspection. I think it was without authority, and the small practitioner was ordered to hold a meeting immediately to get it ratified, which I thought was a bit weak. And what the IP did was they closed the case. And it was come up on my review to restore the case and examine other things that had gone in the case. So I've seen sort of, you see so many, you get up into. My approach, I think there's a perception amongst big firms that small firms might be worse, not as good. There's a slight arrogance, I suppose, but equally small firms do worry about inspections, possibly more than big firms do. It's dealt with by a central unit or whatever, but it's their livelihood. If they get it wrong, that's it. Bang, crash, firm, mortgage, house, everything goes. Whereas, conceptually in a big firm, they could have their license restricted or lost and still have a role within a firm. Interesting topic. So moving on, Numerica and what happened in 2005. It's all a bit ancient history now, but a lot of people listening to this may not be aware of it. What are your memories of an IP firm going bust, effectively?
Well, in 2005, just to correct you on that, 2005, we were taken over by Vantis PLC. We didn't actually go into an administration process at that point. So in 2005, Numerica was insolvent, but effectively Vantis came along and purchased the shares of Numerica and then acquired the business. It was 2010 when Vantis itself did go into an administration process, and the business recovery part of it was purchased by FRP, newly formed management buyout, and the non-insolvency part, the audit and the tax part, was taken over by Tenon, which of course itself went through the same process. And the funniest parts of the failure of Vantis, if you can find it funny, is that of course we in the business recovery department could see the signs far quicker than anyone else in the firm. not helped by the fact that in February 2010, considering that we actually ended up going bust in June 2010, in February 2010, a guy turned up in our department and repossessed the coffee maker. He took it away for non-payment. So at that stage, we had, between us as partners, we had a business review, an IBR on our own firm that we were writing in our sort of spare time, because we could see all of the telltale signs of what was going to happen when the firm asked us to stop being paid our salaries at the end of the month and to get them paid after the 19th of the following month so that they could save a month's national insurance contributions. It's sort of, we realised the writing was on the wall.
Are you saying the team survived for 4 months without coffee?
we had to go to Robert Dyas and buy a kettle and some cups. But it was funny at the time because, you know, if you can't pay your coffee bill, there's a fairly good chance that you're going to go bust at some stage.
Good. Well, thank you for correcting me. So was it a pre-pack?
It was a pre-pack, and everyone was cheapied over to their relevant firm, and I've still got the letter which was sent to me by the administrator telling me that I had been cheapied to FRP advisory. So yes, that was the only time that I do feel when I dealt with employees on cheapy situations that I could say to them, look, I have been the other side of the fence. So I've been where you've been, but not quite in the same circumstances that they find themselves in.
So what's your view on pre-packs generally, having been inside and around them and everything else? Where do you sit?
I think you have to look back at the history of this. So that when I first started doing sort of appointments in my own name in the 1990s, the majority of business rescues at that stage were effected by way of an administrative receivership. And the only real debenture holders who used that process were clearing banks. And they had a policy in the 1990s of giving receivers an overdraft facility on their appointment and telling them to trade businesses and to put an advert in the Financial Times and to see if you could find a buyer that way. Now, some sales went through to management and some sales went through to external buyers, but that market worked very well. But then, following the Enterprise Act in 2002, the first real sort of test of pre-packs came during the financial crisis of 2008. And part of that was because the nature of business in the UK had changed quite dramatically in those 10 or 20 years. During even the 80s, during Thatcher's time, there'd been a sort of deindustrialization of businesses. So in the early 90s, I only ever dealt with engineering businesses, metal bashers. I never dealt with a service business. But by 2008, we were just dealing with service businesses. And when you've got a service business, pre-pack suddenly looks like a viable option because you're terrified that lack of continuity is going to cause the whole thing to fall apart. Added to which, we also had seen the rise of invoice discounters and factoring companies, and they wanted a pre-pack culture because they wanted their existing debtor book in the old company to be collected, and they wanted to have a new customer, i.e. the same people, as a second sort of business line that they could make money out of. So they saw that pre-packs were an opportunity for them to charge termination fees first time round and to then charge fees on a higher level risk base for the second time around. So 2008, there were a lot of pre-packs, and this is where it went wrong. And the reason it went wrong is that we as a profession did not get across to the press and to the public the benefit of a pre-pack or why it was the only exit that was possible. And so we allowed the narrative to be led by the creditor saying, I would have got my money back if they hadn't done a pre-pack. And they did a pre-pack and I've lost all my money and they've started to trade again. Now, that was never the case. They were always going to lose their money. They were in an insolvent company. They were going to lose it come what may. But we allowed it to become a sort of either we would have been paid in full or these people have nicked the business with the connivance of the insolvency practitioner. So that's where the problem started.
I think my case of Clydesdale v. Smales, I think, was 2008,
So there you go.
2009, which also put the boot in a little, and I think it was described as one of the cases of the year, but it never actually developed into anything. But the concept of having an independent review of the pre-pack was very much in vogue in 2008, 2009.
Yeah, and I think that the problem was then, as soon as the papers picked it up and said it's a terrible thing, then constituents wrote in to parliamentarians, and it got on the radar of Parliament that this was a bad thing that we were doing, that we were somehow in a smoke-filled room doing deals underhand just to leave the creditors out of it. And so Vince Cable, when he became the business secretary in the coalition government, decided to commission a report by Theresa Graham on prepacks. Now, that as soon as that was announced, I knew we were in trouble. And the reason why is because nobody writes a report where the conclusions are, let's leave everything the same. No one does. They have to put their mark on it. They have to show that there are weaknesses which could be changed. And I'm not saying that there weren't weaknesses, but I certainly didn't think that Theresa Graham's report findings were the answer. And I remember in 2014 when they came out, going to a seminar at the Institute about it. And it was Tony Murphy, who's an insolvency practitioner, was the only person who jumped up and down and said, this is nonsense. And I thought at the time, yeah, everyone else just seemed to accept that we should go through the rigmarole of ticking boxes just to satisfy what is a process that we're allowed to follow. And remember, Steve, as you well know, we are licensed. It's a bit like saying to a doctor, you can only do this if you fill in a 17-page checklist. Well, you're not a doctor. I'm not a doctor. They are the people who are trained and experienced in dealing with this matter. Why on earth should they be sort of stopped from doing what they are licensed to do because you don't like the outcome? So that whole report situation. And of course, what followed was that the Insolvency Service and our trade association both rolled over and said, yeah, let's have all of those recommendations because we think they're fine, even though the majority of IPs on the ground probably thought, well, this is not going to make a blind bit of difference. You know, it's a voluntary scheme, and when you use the word voluntary, people don't use it. So the whole thing, I think, has been badly handled by all parties, and now we've got the regulations on connected party transactions. And has there been much? I suppose you could argue that the press coverage has died down, but it may have died down anyway because it's not. There was a time when it was newsworthy, when it was high-profile people pre-packing. I'm not sure whether it's as newsworthy now, but anyway, I think I think a pre-pack is sometimes the only option that a company can have. I think there have been some bad pre-packs, but I think that, you know, as a concept, it should not be banned or even be in a conversation to be banned, the sale of a business to a connected party, in my opinion.
It's very hard to sort of look at a sort of a factual alternative without all that. Would the regulators have done what they've done? I think, you know, regulation over the same period has improved. So with guidance or structure of what's right and what's wrong, IPs have been examined anyway about their pre-packs. And as you say, they're licensed. And one of the functions of licensing is to look at these decisions. Where's the industry going? Are they being approached ethically? I think from my point of view, just on a practical basis, the IPs that were good at pre-packs were generally bad at investigation and litigation. And so, I mean, I had one case where HMRC called me about a case they wanted to do a classic winding up petition, and we persuaded HMRC to do a creditor admin, and which was very unusual for them. And we said, let's rescue the business, because essentially it was an office with 4 desks in it. And we managed to do a pre-pack back to the management for about 100,000, which would have been an asset that just would not have been available in compulsory liquidation. And then having done that, then obviously there was funding to fund the investigation to look at wrongful trading and other aspects of it. Whether or not that creates a very interesting dilemma as to, you know, rescue culture versus, you know, the liquidator skills of pursuing misfeasance. You need to have a balance of both, and that's, you know, it comes back to the license holder. We're all different characters. We do it in slightly different ways. We're not AI. We're not robots. But you need to have the skill set to understand a pre-pack. I think one person once said that you needed to do a pre-pack properly, you needed 4 lawyers or something to represent all the parties.
And I think the other thing is the legal profession always have been very good at having solicitors who are non-contentious and solicitors who are contentious. I think that as an IP profession, we haven't been as open to say, do you know what, I'm really good at transactional work. You know, I am fantastic at being able to sell a business, but I don't like the investigation side. I just don't have the mindset to delve through these things. or I am someone who's incredibly litigious. I like that, finding things in what's gone on in the past, and I like to do it. But we've always tried to sell ourselves as being able to do everything, and I don't think we've been very good at that, because, as I say, I personally don't think that I'm as good as an investigative IP as I am at being a front end. I think I'm much better at getting a business, working out what operationally is wrong with it, and putting it right. And that's where my skill is.
Well, yeah, I'm sort of the opposite end, and I dabble in rescuing things, but my heart's not really in it. I mean, it's not. I just the litigation is always in the background somewhere. But do you think moving on to licensing of firms might change that, where you've got firms appointed and they would be expected to bring a broad skill set? I mean, you could replicate it with a couple of joint appointments, but do you think that will be a way of moving into firm skill sets as opposed to individual skill sets?
I've always been a firm believer that firms should be regulated, and I have personal experience of that from the Miss 60 case, where we started off as a profession having a liquidator or an administrator, and then we decided as a profession that it'd be good to have two of you, just in case one was sick or died, or that we would have continuity in a case, and it wouldn't slow down because the liquidator had died. But in Miss 60, I was just a second practitioner, and I was there really as an insurance policy in case the first practitioner was unable to do the job. As it transpired, the first practitioner lost his license for having done a pretty poor job on it, and I was rowed into it, because I was more well known than him, and a lot of people in the profession said, "Well, that's very strange. I can't imagine Nick did that. Why was Nick involved in that?" And so, from that moment onwards, I said to myself, this is silly. I went through an awful lot of angst about that case when I had absolutely, it wasn't my case. But really, it should be the firm, I think, that should be regulated, and that would make the firm have to look more seriously at making sure that they've trained all their IPs sufficiently to be able to mitigate the risk. So, yeah, I'm a big believer in firm regulation, not individual regulation.
We did an episode a few episodes ago on the perils of being a joint appointee and the jeopardy of joints, I think it was called. And we didn't cover the Miss 60 case, but I remember it well. I think there was a case, I remember, because I've attended lots of seminars presented by you, and some people listen to this podcast with their kids in the car, so I won't repeat what you said of them. But you were the first person, I think, to swear in an insolvency seminar I experienced, and you were very relaxed and off the cuff. And I remember you talking. I can't quite describe your tone, but I think it was the case of Eden Note, where you had some criticism, and you were basically saying, "Hey, the judge held that I did it wrong," and that was it. And it was quite refreshing the way that you were quite willing to embrace error and talk about it, which is something I'm keen to do in my work. I litigate a lot. You get criticised in judgments, whether it's fair or not, it doesn't really matter. You're exposing yourself to that risk, and you have to be prepared to stand up either in a seminar or in a judgment and say, "Yeah, okay, I got it wrong," or "You chose to describe it that on that day, but that's the way it goes." So that was quite refreshing to hear you saying that.
Well, it's interesting. When one of the first lectures I ever went to when I came back into the insolvency profession in 1991 was a presentation about members' voluntary liquidations given by a chap called Richard Setcham, who was a partner at PwC. And he started his talk by saying, "Right, put your hands up if you've messed up an MVL." And he put his own hand up as well as everyone else. And then he said, "Right, put your hand up if you've mucked up multiple MVLs," and he put his own hand up again. And I thought that was a good way of sort of trying to get everybody at ease and making them realise that actually the renowned expert who was about to present to us on what we should do not to do wrong on an MVL was also capable of saying, "Yeah, I have messed up too." They are tricky situations, and don't think that they, just because the fee is low, that somehow that makes it an easier assignment. So that's why I based my style on Richard Setcham's style, because I thought that was quite a good way to do it.
I fully agree. I think being involved in litigation, you get your homework marked fairly regularly, and you've got different lawyers testing every single point. So it's quite a different atmosphere in the office. There's a very good clip on the internet of Sarah Pascoe, the comedian. I think she's talking about something like the Hay Book Festival or some festival, where she's asked a question about what would her 14-year-old self think of her, because she's out there as a comedian, and she almost became tearful. And she said, "Yeah, the problem with being 14 is that you've never loved before or whatever. So when you break up, it's the worst thing ever. But it's only once you've had multiple, relationships that you learn that there's life after breakup, things like that. And there's a lot of things where IP used to use the same thing. So there's life after getting a case wrong, It's not just sort of like, oh my God, I made a mistake, I'm going to lose my license and everything. And you can, particularly the way licensing is personal, go immediately to the worst and think, oh my God, it's over. And then slowly you learn it's just criticism. Get over it. It's part of your career to have highs and lows.
Yeah, and I always started my career thinking I never wanted to lose a case. I didn't want to ever be quoted as a losing party on a bit of litigation. I never wanted to be sued for negligence, and I didn't want to have a disciplinary hearing with my regulator. I had all four within one particular year in the 90s and realised that, it just happens. And that doesn't make me a terrible IP. It just was the nature of the circumstances all conspired against me in that particular 12-month period. But I came through it.
Yeah, I mean, my first job was Barclays International, I looked across effectively the trading floor. I thought if I keep my head down, I could be age 65 in the corner office. And I didn't want that. I wanted the complete opposite. So the chaos, the fights, I don't know what I'm going to do tomorrow. That just suits my personality. And that's it. There's people who in some of the big firms who will earn a very nice salary for 30, 40 years and leave without a trace. And that's not really for me, and I think for you. But moving on, you then became R3 president. I think it was 2008, 2009. There you are. You're president of the industry. You can change everything. How did that go? And what's your thoughts about R3? I suppose everything.
Before I became R3 president, I was a very big believer that it should be a year-on-year process. And that was a democratic way to do it. Having done it for a year, I wish that I could have taken it as a dictatorship and actually ran it for 10 years, because in a year you can only do so much. And then the next president comes along and probably changes half of the things that you thought were going to be cast in stone. I wanted to be president so that I could keep the subs where they were, which was a very controversial thing to do at the time I did it, because there was a sort of feeling that subscriptions should go up year by year with inflation just by virtue of it. And I took a different view, which was, what actually are you getting for the money that you pay? At that point, when I was president, I didn't feel that R3 was necessarily providing what the members want. And I also felt that it was a bit unfair that we were paying a block subscription to Insol International without necessarily being as open to our members that part of their subs was going to Insol International. I felt that and I couldn't really see what a sole practitioner would necessarily gain out of a block of money going to Insol International. So I wanted to be the president to sort of stop that or at least stop the subscriptions going up, and to have a discussion about Insol International. We ended up with no real change in the circumstances, because before you know it, the year's up and you're ceremoniously turfed out and replaced by somebody else who wants to do things in a different way to how you want to do it.
So 4-year terms for presidents?
I think certainly a year is not long enough, because but they have changed the way they do it at R3, and they changed around the time I was there, whereby you now have an executive committee made up of the president, the vice president, the deputy vice president, and the past president, to try and, if you like, sort of get rid of the rough edges behind what a president wants to do. So in a way, it's meant to be more continuity. So even if the person at the top changes, it doesn't change the direction of travel. Personally, I quite like changing the direction of travel, and I wanted it to be a bit more focused towards smaller practitioners and what they wanted. And that's the thing that R3 does very well. The smaller practices community is an area where they do sort of put on a good event, and lots of people attend. So I felt that there is a market for them to do more on that. I do feel sometimes they concentrate too much on things which don't necessarily impact on the smaller community. But that may be because I came from a small community background. So other presidents may look at it in different ways.
I suppose over your career, in the 80s, I think it was the IPA was essentially the trade body. And then with regulation, I can't remember exactly when the Society of Practitioners of Insolvency was formed. It was the late 90s where it changed its name to R3 to be more a bigger church. What do you think of R3 in its current state in terms of just the direction of travel, I suppose, of the industry? if it's not R3? Where do you think the profession's
I
going?
think the difficulty for R3 is that there was originally a limited membership. You know, they wanted it to just be insolvency practitioners or people who got licenses, and then they realised that actually they could go out of business if they don't sort of expand their membership base to sort of represent more of the restructuring industry. Now it's become a sort of anyone can join virtually. You know, you can join on it. They've obviously done a firm membership to try and enhance the people that they can get into the situation. So I think it is it's a broadening church, but with that you could dilute the message, because what an insolvency practitioner wants isn't necessarily what the turnaround practitioner might want, or what a supplier to the insolvency industry might want. So I'm not sure that it serves its full purpose of what we originally, or what it was originally set up for. But you know, it's a changing market, and they feel that they need to change and adapt to stay relevant in this market.
I mean, certainly one of the remits of this podcast is to sort of reflect what's being said in the bar after the seminar as opposed to what's on the stage. And certainly lots of comments to me are talking about R3 is quite good at training. But, I mean, just there's more solicitors as president than insolvency practitioners now. And there's so many larger firms which are just not really part of R3 at all. There's almost no point in having the smaller practices distinction anymore, because it is where the IPs are involved, it's the smaller stuff. And you know, the criticism to me is, so they're saying it's like just a system that's for selling things to IPs. Here's some training. Here's some lawyers wanting some work, but is it banging the drum? And who are the big beasts that are going to be leading it? You know, where's the big depth of experience? The insolvency practitioner fights back, as it were. So there's a general muttering I think I've received. So some things R3 does very well, but what it's sort of not perceived as being for IPs anymore. And I think that's whether or not that's good. As I say, the dilution of the message is a concern to some IPs.
And I think they've got a lot on their plate, R3, in trying to stay relevant with government, trying to stay relevant with the regulators, trying to stay relevant with the insolvency service, trying to stay relevant with HMRC. So they've got a lot on their plate. And I'm not sure whether they fully succeed on any part. They would probably, it might be an idea to have Caroline, the CEO of R3, on as a separate podcast, and she can explain, you know, quite what they do. But sometimes I feel that I don't see what progress they're making on these various fronts. I can see them sort of agreeing with the insolvency service on lots of things. Well, that's great. But actually, what about challenging the insolvency service on certain things? You know, the gripe of smaller practitioners used to be that the official receiver was competing with us for our work on smaller cases, and they probably weren't doing as good a job as we would do on them. And that's the role of a trade association, really, is to say, sorry, you know, our members are better than you, and we should be doing more of this work. So I sometimes feel that they're a bit too concerned about falling out with people. And I understand that. I'm not saying you should fall out with people regularly, but sometimes you do need to call people out, even your friends. You need to call them out on these situations. And if we don't do that with the insolvency service or HMRC, then, you know, what are we doing? What's the point of paying our subs?
No, I think picking up on your point about the pre-packs, about the sort of losing the message, you know, sort of 15 years ago, it doesn't feel like there's quite the IP's champion anymore. There's no one standing up and saying we are great. There's a champion for the rescue profession or things generally, but litigious IPs would grumble that there's not really enough representation of them in certain sectors. Again, the 1 year presidential rule means that any litigious IP who gets into the office says a few speeches and then they're planning for their successor. So it's tinking with it. So there's maybe, you know, a lot of these organisations were pre-internet days, pre-social media days. Whether or not it's going to go another direction will be interesting to see. Change the subject again. Anything on litigation funding? You were at Manolay for a bit. Just wonder what your experiences of that. Any views on litigation funding in the current market?
I think the thing about Manolay, going to Manolay, was I quite liked the idea that they didn't require the IP to take out adverse insurance, adverse cost insurance, and ATA. And I quite like that they were prepared to stand behind the cases that they took on, and therefore, and my experience on cases that I'd looked at during my time as an IP where other IPs had bought litigation was that they had made a recovery and most of it had gone in the uplift for solicitor, uplift for barrister, uplift for ATE premium, and there was very little left at the end of it. And I always felt to myself, whose benefit has this been done for? Is it really been done for the creditors, or is it really been done just because you thought it was a claim that could be bought? But actually, the outcome is served nobody's purposes other than the litigation funder, etc. And so I was quite pleased when I went to Mandalay. Of course, the problem with litigation funders is they are effectively needing to make a huge return on their money because it's a risky industry that they're investing in. They don't get the best cases. The cases that are the real slam dunks gets kept by IPs and are litigated in the old-fashioned sense. But they only really get the ones that are more high risk, and with more high risk comes higher premiums. So they can look very expensive. And if you're an IP that's not used to litigation or not used to litigation funders, you can quite often see the price of everything and the value of nothing. And so therefore, if Manolete offer you a sum of money up front, £5,000, £10,000, and then 50% of the proceeds, you look at it and say, 5,000, 10,000, that's nothing. It's an absolute disgrace. It's a £300,000 claim. 50%, they want 150,000. And when you're trying to say to people, well, actually, what happens if you get naught? What happens if you lose? You're not on the hook for it. Mandalay don't get their 50%, but you don't suffer anymore. So and I always remember that I spoke to an IP once who had a massive claim against the British government on a particular thing, and he said that this claim was going to net £1 billion if it came off, right? And that he had done a deal with his employers that he got 20% of the proceeds of this claim personally. So he was looking at 200 million himself. And that would mean he could retire and he'd spend his life on a speedboat living in a life of luxury. I saw him 6 weeks later and said, what happened? He said, the case struck out, first hearing. So it's just best not to make plans. So I do think litigation funding has a place, but it's alongside traditional litigation, it certainly has a place. But there's a lot more education needs to be done as to the reasons why the premiums that they charge or the percentages they charge appear on the face of it to be so high. And maybe that's a question of sending out more statistics, etc., which show the number of cases that succeed, the number of cases that they lose money on.
I think we're back to the same point, which is IPs are licensed. It's their job to understand this asset and handle it. So it's a market out there. Manolete and other litigation funders are available. They price their things in different ways, shop around, look at the CFA market, look at everything. I think we're drawing to a close now. You're retired now. How do you want to be remembered in the profession? Do you want to be remembered at all?
What I always felt when Miss 60 came about and there was all this bad publicity about, how terrible the IPs had been and my name was involved. Most people who knew me or had come across me or had worked with me or dealt with me all said, well, Nick is just a genuinely open, honest person. He just is. He's just not that sort of character. He hasn't got the ability to be devious. He's just a nice man. And that's how I always want to be remembered. Just the more people think I'm a nicer bloke than think I'm sure some of the directors that I've dealt with on some of my cases can't stand me. And I'm sure there'll be people who think that I'm just an absolute horror for what I did in taking their houses away from them if they were bankrupt or closing their businesses down and making them redundant. But the majority of people in the profession, I think, generally think that I'm a decent, honest person. And I think that's all you can hope for, is that, especially in an industry like ours, where we are, every decision we make is affecting people's livelihoods. I think if you can come out of it with people being more sort of positive to you than negative to you, I think you've ended up doing a good job.
Last question. What's life like after being in insolvency? How are you filling your days, or how do you plan to fill your days?
Well, the first thing to say is that on my last day of work, I deleted my Outlook app on my phone, and that was the 12th of December, and we're now sitting here in April. I haven't thought about any of my work, any job, anything I've done, not for one moment. In fact, I've probably forgotten the name of some of the cases that I had in my last block transfer. So that indicates to me that I got the timing right. I don't miss the work. What I have noticed, though, is that you will miss the people if you retire, because you come across so many really nice people in insolvency, and you've got to make an effort to stay in touch and see them, because if you don't make the effort, that what held you together was working together and working on a job, or working in conjunction with somebody. But when that's not there, it can be easily forgotten, and people that you do like, you've got to make an effort to go and see them. So from that point of view, I am doing a lot more in terms of putting things in my diary to make sure that I keep in touch with people. It may be 2 months away, 3 months away, 4 months away, but I am being much better at trying to see people, and just trying to stay in touch with those people that I want to stay in touch with. But apart from that, I am just enjoying the fact that when the alarm doesn't go off, I don't have to get up. I'm quite enjoying the fact that if I wanted to lounge around till 9 o'clock in the morning, I can. Having got up at 5:30 or 5:45 for best part of 38 years of work, it's quite nice not knowing you can or you can't do things. So I would definitely recommend retirement to people, but at the right time. Don't go too early, but certainly don't leave it too late.
I was talking to a lawyer who's contemplating retirement, and he said the thing he'll miss is the cricket. It's the jollies, it's the events,
You won't get
it's that
invited.
side.
Yes.
The invites are going to stop dead. That's what he's worried about.
Indeed.
Well, you're welcome on here anytime if you're looking to fill up your diary. So, well, thank you very much, Nick, and that's been Dodging Bullets.